I am in Los Angeles, and this is the second edition of our kind of newly reinvented education Upended. We're doing more interview style and discussion. So we've given it an hour and a half. And Yasmina, I'll introduce her in a second. She and I are gonna chat and share some slides. And then for the second half, we're going to open it up for discussion with the group. So start thinking about, like, if you have questions along the way, maybe write them down, because then we can have a really robust discussion at the end. So without further ado, Yasmina, will you please tell us a little bit about yourself? And you can start sharing your slides whenever you feel comfortable.
Okay. Now, so we were both playing with new Zoom things this morning, so I'm going to have to disrupt your share.
Yes.
And then share my own. Okay, here we go. Did it work?
Yes.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Yasmina. I am part of the National Training and Technical Assistance Center for Child, Youth, and Family Mental Health. I am the lead for the school-based services team. And the National Training and Technical Assistance Center is a multidisciplinary team that includes our partners at Youth Move National, University of Texas, Georgetown, the American Academy of Pediatrics, with one overall goal of helping children, youth, young adults, and their families access the necessary services they need to be healthy and well in a well-coordinated system of care. We're funded by SAMHSA, but all the opinions expressed today are mine and mine alone. So why should you be here with me? Why here right now? So my name is Yasmina, and I am an educator by accident and a mental health professional by training. And I wound up after a strange career across all the sectors of care in mental health and juvenile justice and child welfare. I wound up as a prevention specialist in Tolleson Union High School District in Phoenix. And that was the best. I love working with kids. I love working with the adults, and my job was to help implement multi-tiered systems of support. But I wanted to make change, and I was running into roadblocks. So I was like, well, if you can't beat them, go work for the state education agency where you get to make some of the rules. So I did that. And I was working on Project Aware as a state director, and then was the director of school safety and social wellness for Arizona Department of Education. And then the pandemic happened. And so I have a unique view of many of the sectors of care at both the state level, the site level, the district level, the school level, and then also working with families in their homes. So today, what I hope we can do together is reframe the way we talk about mental health and reframe the way we think about it in schools. We're going to talk mostly about what is mental health. We're going to check in with each other real quick. I'm hopefully going to tell some really good jokes and you're all going to laugh. We're going to define mental health, talk about what it is. We're going to do that by talking about what it is not. We're going to talk about the physical impact of mental health, and we're going to talk about mental health as wellness and what you as educators can do to make a difference. So I think I just saw Leora here. Hello, Leora, welcome. We are checking in. So how are you feeling today? You can either use this Nicolas Cage chart right here, or you can use a handy feelings wheel, which I had in the notes of this PowerPoint, but now I no longer do. It's thefeelingswheel.org. So I'm gonna watch the chat, see what I get here. Oh, happy. Brenda says she's stressed. Lindsay's excited. Lara's just focused on Nicolas Cage. Christy, meh. You're feeling Emily's feeling Con Air Nicolas Cage. That's a good way to feel. Focused. Okay, I love it. Stress Nicolas Cage. Yes. Well, we're all coming in a combination of many things, a combination of many Nicolas Cages. And thinking about all that we bring to our, the excited, yes, Tina, the excited Nicolas Cage is a little bit creepy. We all come to this world as educators with an essential question that has to frame what we're doing. So I'd really love it if you took out a pencil and a piece of paper and in your own words, define mental health to someone hearing the term for the very first time. This is one of the things I had to do most often with teachers, with parents and families, is talking to them about what is mental health. So try and keep your explanation as simple and easy to understand as possible. And then feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to share, or you can keep your definition to yourself, or you can type it in the chat. Pat says mental health is a state of well-being. I like that. So when we're working with school or state leaders, especially if we're one of those crossover mental health professionals coming into an education sector from the mental health world, we often forget to take the time to connect and consider the basic definitions that frame our work. Mental health can be super tricky to define, especially in an education context. So sometimes the thing that I like to do is when I'm struggling to define what something is I like to define what something isn't, because that helps me narrow down what something is. So what is mental health not? And PS, something fun about me, my love language is memes. And I recently read an article that memes are tiny little pictures to communicate complex social norms. So I felt really validated by that. So what is mental health not? Mental health is not something that is graded. Mental health is not something that can be done the right way. Hi, Brian, I see you there. And the best way to be mentally healthy is really individual and up for us to define for ourselves. Mental health is not a static experience. Much like that menagerie of Nicolas Cages that greeted us today, it's not a destination. It's not somewhere to arrive. Mental health is our ability to engage in community, to feel connected, worthy, and well. So one of the reasons I like this scale is, well, I like anyone who uses thriving on a mental health scale, but it really shows the back and forth. Some days we might be thriving, some days we might be struggling, and some days we might just really need help. Mental health, ooh, Emily, and I like Emily added another definition of mental health into the chat box, a state of feeling connected to oneself. That's very Zen of you, Emily. Mental health is not, and I also want to say thank you to Leora for this treasure trove of mental health resources in our shared file. It's not something that happens or remains in isolation. So when we often talk about mental health in Western culture, we send folks off to go heal alone. We send folks off to go cope alone. We give them things to do by themselves, to listen to music, to write in a journal. But oftentimes mental health is about being connected to others. And when we think about our own healing and our own wellness, often it doesn't happen just meditating peacefully. And what I really want to dispel is the myth that mental health is sunshine and rainbows and feeling happy all the time. Mental health is our ability to weather the storms. So what is mental health? What do we know that it is, now that we know a little bit about what it isn't? Is there anything else that mental health isn't that you all hear commonly in your sectors? Toughing it out. Yeah, Ryan. Lara, I saw you unmute.
No, just, yeah, that really resonates, because I think that's often a message that's communicated, right? Just tough it out.
Or maybe behavior.
Mm.
Adrian, punitive and labels, yeah. So what do we know mental health is, if we know what it's not? Well, one thing we know that it is for sure is it's directly linked to our physical health. How well we are inside impacts everything from the chemical productions that regulate our nerve impulses, to the amount of cortisol that our brain makes, to our sleep, which is highly impactful on our ability to function, to our ability to maintain connection and relationships. And then we know that poor mental health can lead to things like heart disease or stroke from things like stress. And in the classroom, as educators, it can look like behavior. And without a full understanding of what mental health is and what mental health isn't, we run the risk of assigning discipline, like Adriana mentioned, or labels to our kids when it's really a mental health condition, when it's really a communication of, I need help to be well. What else is mental health? Mental health is intersectional and individual. And when I was making this presentation and I stumbled upon this, I was like, this is a beautiful way to explain the diversity and the intersectionality of what it means to be well. These don't say a specific way that we need to achieve self-connection, healing, balance. These are basic needs of being human. And that might look different across different cultures. That might look different across different family systems. But teaching, go ahead, Lara.
You know what this reminds me of? Sorry, Yasmina, you know how I just all of a sudden I had this remembering there was, that's why you and I flow well. This research study that shared that the amount of empowerment and power and choice and freedom that young people, I think they studied high school students, had at school was direct correlation to their well-being. So I was looking at this autonomy section and thinking, because I really loved that enough, I can find it, I will. But you know, really directly relating their sense of empowerment and power and how much advocacy and agency they had in their school day was absolutely directly related to their well-being. So I just really appreciate that they included that on this wheel.
Yeah, one of the best things I think that we can do as educators is to find different ways to increase power with our students, power with our educators, because they often know what their needs are. We just have to give them opportunity to participate in the process. So what is mental health? Mental health is wellness, and wellness changes. And some days you're following a balanced diet and you're eating regularly, and you've got your mindfulness techniques. You got up in the morning, you're sitting on your pillow and you're feeling Con Air, Nicolas Cage. And some days you're screaming into a pillow and eating cake over a sink. And as long as you have, and that doesn't make it bad, that doesn't make you bad. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to cry. It's okay to have the full spectrum of experience. I'm going to go. And so this is my takeaway for everyone today. I hope you can print this slide off. You can hang it in your office and you can think about it. I took the Nicolas Cages and I made them into a spectrum of wellness. Because some days we're Con Air Nicolas Cage, and some days we're Bees Nicolas Cage. And being okay with the entire spectrum of the human experience is what makes us as educators good role models. Every moment we interact with our students, with another adult, is a teachable moment. And if we're modeling to them good mental health, they see that. Good mental self-care, honoring our boundaries, being honest with ourselves. Because wellness and how it's defined is culturally influenced and subjective. And we are the leaders in our classrooms. And how we talk about mental health, our own and other folks, is really, really important to the messages that our kids and our families receive. So how might the way we describe behaviors in the classroom or our own change the way we interpret the symptom? If you'd like to respond, you can answer in the chat. You can unmute yourself. I'm practicing clinical silence.
I like to say one thing about the behaviors part, because a lot of times I think it's about our perceptions, right? And our experiences and how we're raised. And one of the things when I was teaching was the idea that, you know, some teachers had that loud voice in the morning, you know, but I was kind of like you. I was a teacher that has the music going in the morning, because that can kind of shift the behavior, shift the mood. We don't know exactly what they're coming with. And so a great way to try to equalize that, if you will, in the moods in the room, is to maybe start with, you know, some type of mindfulness or some type of calming, so that we are not labeling these behaviors as negative, but it could just be a result of their experiences and what they experienced that day or that morning or whatever the case may be. So I think there just might be a way to change that by dipping into knowing that other person or who those kids are, and providing some other outlet or equalizer at the beginning of the day.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. How have you seen the impacts of labeling show up in your work?
Well, now I'm on the other side of it. I work mostly with educators. And so what I'm seeing now is that this is something that adults also deal with, right? Adults also come with their own ideas and perspectives, right? And perceptions of behaviors. And so a lot of it is trying to dismantle some of those, that misinformation about certain behaviors or terms, to be perfectly honest, so that, again, we can kind of establish that equalizer or that space. So currently that's the biggest thing, just being more self-reflective and talking about those things openly with other adults. So
Thank you, Emily. And Adriana, I really like what you shared in the chat. I think it was you. We repeatedly model sharing our stories, then others slowly join as they see it's okay and safe. Yeah, it was. And I swear I didn't pay Adriana, and everyone knows it's 5 o'clock in the morning in New Zealand, so she probably wouldn't have remembered. Because the reason that I choose this slide is because I am a human who does live with ADHD. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I began to really change my own perspective on what I had been, on the messages that had been communicated to me about what ADHD was and how that impacted your life. And it wasn't until adulthood that I was able to reframe my perspective on what had been seen as a deficit. And I'm never going to be good at calendaring across time zones. I've just surrendered that. It's just not who I am. But I am incredibly good to have to ideate or to listen or to dream big. And I might be fidgety and I can't sit in my seat, but I can do a lot of other things. And so reframing my own perspective started with myself, and it allowed me to give empathy to others.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what can you do as educators, mental health professionals, or people who might have small humans in your life? You can normalize mental health with the same empathy and understanding as physical health and illness. And I love Nathan Pyle, his book, Strange Planet. If I were still in classrooms working with kids with autism spectrum disorders, I would use them for social stories all the time, because it's a very good way to communicate basic components of relating to others. Bonnie shared something in the chat that I'm really processing for just a minute. Schools tend to stereotype students based on their past experiences with older siblings. Who put a reaction? Who's seen that happen? Or their parents coming from the wrong side of school It makes them hyper-focused on who the student is and sometimes less patient with the parents and those behaviors. Yeah, compared to other students in the classroom. Yep.
Yeah.
Sometimes I had to fight for schedule changes because of something that happened with another sibling, and that was very confusing to me. We're all our own individuals. So how can educators make a difference? When we think about the continuum of care in a school or the systems of care within a school and how they connect to our community, we have to understand that the biggest impact, the biggest, I'd like to say, bang for our buck, if I'm talking to someone who controls the budget, is the mental health promotion, prevention, and pre-reactive activities. They're the culture and climate, the things that make us connected to the school and each other. And I also think that Lara shared a really good story with me earlier this week about a really, Lara, I'm gonna let you share the story actually about the place that was built, that there was not a conversation with the community that before it happened.
Yes, Yasmina and I were dreaming questions and discussion points for today. And I was talking about school settings where I think at first they problematized the issue as access. And so they built this amazing community wellness center and they outreached. It was a community school. So they had a lot of great partnerships in the community. So they built it. They had a brand new health and wellness center built in the school and nobody came. And so then they had to really step back, and luckily they had an amazing system for thinking about things collectively with the community. And they were like, we have this beautiful space and all these great partners. Oh, it's the stigma in the community around mental health, and what is mental health, and how do we access mental health, and am I sick, am I well, are people going to look at me, just all of this was keeping people from taking advantage of what was there. And so then they had to really think about how to dispel that and make people feel comfortable. And they did through peer advocacy and peer training and with parents and with kids. And they did this amazing, and within 6 months, they had a thriving mental and physical health clinic going. But that was a real learning for me to watch happen, as a support person for that school. And we were talking about how that might show up in our communities.
So how many of you can use a reaction, have been part of a school where an intervention was voluntold to the community and maybe the teacher community? And then when the teachers received that information from the district office, they're like, this isn't going to work. What were they thinking?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's really important to have those conversations with your school communities. And it's really important to understand where they are coming from and what's important to the community that we serve. Because I know we have some folks here, from not America, but in this land we now call America. A lot of the folks in front of our classrooms don't look like the students that they teach. And so understanding and creating those connections is really important when we talk about being culturally responsive, culturally aware, and trauma informed. So what can you do? What can you personally do starting today, right now, this moment, the end? You can start with compassion for yourself. You are living in the middle of the second year of a pandemic. You are surviving a complete change to your profession if you're an educator, a complete change to your profession if you're a mental health professional, a complete change to your profession if you're a consultant, a complete change to so it goes on, right? And we don't have all the answers yet, and we might not have all the answers for a long time. But I hope that you start with yourself, because that will radiate outwards like a ripple in a pond. But if you're one of those folks who would like something less esoteric and more tangible to start with, it can feel overwhelming. And sometimes we get stuffed and shoved and voluntold a million programs and we don't know where to start. And our sector is flush with money for the very first time that I can remember in my career. And my face cream might tell otherwise, but I've been here for a while. And so needing help to know how funding can be utilized, needing help to know how funding can be braided, needing help to know that sometimes it's okay to say no if you can't spend the money in a way that will help your community. You can try that free resource that it has a QR code. And this presentation will also be available to everyone after today. That resource goes to a federal funding guide. And there's one grant on there that might not be, that has recently ended, but it will list a lot of the different funding streams that are available that can directly or indirectly address mental health. So now my question to you is, if you wrote down your definition of mental health at the beginning of this session, has your definition changed? And what would you add? What would you take out? Or what would you modify? So I'll take us back to that first slide. Now, okay, Adriana's had a little bit of a change. How would you all define mental health? To a kid or their family. Emily, I see your hand is up. Go ahead.
I was just gonna add to my definition. So I would say it's feeling connected to oneself, but also having empathy for others. I think that's the important part to add to the end of that definition.
Lara, I didn't ask you to share what your definition of mental health was, but now that it's over and it won't spoil the whole session, what's your definition of mental health?
Mine. Yeah, I think I really resonate with what Adriana put, that it has evolved over time for sure. And especially the more I work with wonderful folks like you guys, just thinking about, I'm definitely of the, I grew up stuffing everything, everything's fine, toughing it out. That's why Brian said at the beginning, I was like, oh, I feel that, right? That was mental health for me, was to be fine. I'm fine, when you're absolutely not fine, right? So I think for me, that understanding of the spectrum of wellness and feeling all the feels, like that's been my life work now, in the last 10 years, is to learn how to feel the feels and be okay with that. And seeing, and then being able to see that in other people too, because I think I had an expectation that other people were fine also, right? And there was something wrong if they weren't fine. And I didn't understand why people were freaking out because they were supposed to be fine. And so I think that in the last 10 years especially, I've really come to understand and really rethink about my students too, and how I understood their behavior and their parents. We were talking about families and family histories that come to school with them. But yeah, I think really making that, connection to myself, to making sure that I'm really focusing on my own ability to do this, not just talking about it with other people. I think that's really been a new understanding in the last few years for me. And just it's really hard when you grow up with it being pathologized, of always thinking about that. I have a brother with mental illness, and, just how people think about that, express it, it's really hard to reframe that. Brian,
I see that you have your hand raised as well.
Well, yeah, just kind of rolling off that inquiry to your point there, Lara, is my question and discernment is within how our system's structured, such that one has to be pathologized and in order to be eligible for services. So I just wonder about identity and
I think you cut out, Brian, but I heard something. He has a really good freeze. I think someone should screenshot that and share it with him. He would like that. Someone said to me yesterday, one of the tension points with the current world of mental health is that you have to be considered broken in order to access care.
Yeah.
And how different would our systems be if you didn't have to be viewed as diagnosably ill to receive support?
Yeah. And we've talked about this in a lot of different venues. And Leora, I definitely want you to unmute yourself in a second here, because I have a son that has pretty severe mental health needs. And I used to try to explain it to people that it's like, if he had a broken arm, they might fix it. But with mental health, they had to wait till he was in, years of acute crisis and hospitalizations before they were like, oh, you might need some help. He might need some support. There had to be a very severe perception of his unwellness, his illness, his need before there was a perception of need for support either. So that was really an eye-opener for me, having gone through that as a parent. Leora, power. What are your thoughts?
Oh. So, hi everyone, good morning. I get to have the honor of being Lara's colleague adjacent and Yasmina's colleague less adjacent. What's coming up for me and in this conversation is that oftentimes there's a lot of words that we use, that I'm hearing and that we use in the field as really coded and charged language that are rooted in deep constructs of power, and wanting us to potentially take a moment, especially when I'm hearing us use the word empathy or in the slide about need. I'm curious if the community would be open to complicating and problematizing terms that are super racialized and classed and gendered across power, of who we allow to express empathy, who's required to exercise more empathy than others, whose needs are validated over others. What does distress look like from a power lens? And just like curious if we might get a little feisty in that conversation. And I think I'm coming off of a couple days where I've just heard a lot of kind of shorthand, we need to be kind to each other. And that always makes me go like who's allowed to be kind, whose kindness is never allowed to actually be received, and just wanting us to maybe go there a little bit if folks are interested in that.
I think you read your audience well. But does anyone have any thoughts on that? Is that something that we're open to? Would you like me to bring that slide about need back up?
Yeah, bring that slide back up. And I would be interested to hear about this. This is like a light bulb is going off in my head right now of like, this is the first time I'm ever hearing this perspective. And forgive me, I was in the COVID response world, so I'm just back into like behavioral health. So I've just been out of the loop for a little bit, but I would love to hear more about that.
This is why we keep inviting each other to have these conversations, because within the spectrum of what's gone on in the last 2 years, we've been in response, right, to some really, really acute emergencies. And what I observed at the state level when that emergency was taking place, we didn't always have the time, capacity, or ability to unpack the nuance when you're talking about getting basic needs met. And now we have schools back to business and reopened, and we're just seeing the impact of that last couple of years of response, reaction. And now we have to reset and recenter. And one of the things I think Leora, a tension point that she's beautifully knocking on the door here, is when we look at, I'm just going to give well-being, for example, and the first one, healing. When we think about who is allowed to heal, who is disproportionately offered access to care? Who is disproportionately offered access to care that is not heavy psychotropic medications? Is that care in a language that, that you speak? Is that healing aligned with, let's go to autonomy, freedom? Did you get to choose your provider? Does that provider look like you? Does that provider know where you came from? Does that provider check in with you to see if the modalities of treatment are resonating with you? And who is more likely to have access to that? And when we think about things like connection under the empathy, love, acceptance, affection, compassion, that was the one that Leora was raising. Think about a lot of our child serving systems. Are they based in understanding connection, love, acceptance, affection, and compassion for the children and families we serve? Or are they systems that disproportionately take children of color from their homes in ways that can sometimes be traumatizing? And so these are basic needs, but is everyone able to access them equally, equitably? Sorry, oops. Let me get to the chat quick, it went away.
Well, and I think too, when I'm looking more closely at these words and reflecting on what Leora put in the chat too, I mean, as we see people and judge their rage or their anger or their fight against injustice as maladaptive and focus on their inappropriate expression of anger as we, quote unquote, right, inappropriate expression, and don't focus on the systems around them, and because that keeps us distracted from looking at why the system is, putting us in that position. And so always classifying kind of that, rightful rage. Great way to put it, Brian. You're always so good with words. It's like that, you have a rightful rage that then is problematized and not seen as just or appropriate. And then you feel like there's something wrong with you rather than there's something wrong with, what you're fighting against. Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm going to throw a wrench into this wheel and into this whole conversation. I'm just going to drop it there and I'm going to leave it and I'm going to be quiet, because it's always what I think of when I think about COVID. Where does grief fit?
Mm-hmm. That's been a huge conversation with schools that I've been talking with lately. I just was talking with a school in Washington State that had 3 educators die last year, and now they're back full in person. And she's like, yeah, we just sort of skipped over that part. And I said, how's that working out for you? She's like, yeah, we've had more suspensions in the first 6 weeks than all the, last year that we were in school. We have, we can't keep staff. We can't, everyone's falling apart. Like the grief part was not acknowledged, or, it's just, and I've heard that from many schools, and the grief part is hard for people to express, deal with loss. I don't know, but yeah, that really resonates.
And how are we? Oh, thank you, Leora, for putting the beam wheel in there. I'll share my screen. This is another way to look at it. Oh, it didn't go to the wheel. Right here. Here we go. So here's another way to view this.
And we'll share all these resources with you guys in an email. This will be recorded and put on a YouTube link, and then we'll share the link with you, and also all the resources and slides as an attachment.
So even growing from that initial just view of needs, one of the reasons this wheel can take that conversation even further, and I'm glad we're talking about it, is the need for accountability. And that can be some of the challenge with addressing mental health in our classrooms, right? Is this ask for resiliency without accountability? It's the new buzzword for grit that we stopped using about 10 years ago. Leora, did you want to offer any other framing about this? About this wheel?
Oh, I mean, I would invite, if there's anyone else who's more, I mean, I can speak to how we've used this wheel, but curious if there are other educators who are familiar with BEAM and what comes up for you. I'm conscious of me representing BEAM and wanting to open space if others have used this in practice.
These are beautiful resources. Hi, everybody. I'm Susan.
Hi, Susan. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. There's so many different aspects that are playing into this, just like children. You know, there are so many different perspectives and aspects and experiences that kids bring into their own trauma. And I think we really did just like get everybody back to the way it used to be. Let's get back into what we know to be normal, per se. And we jumped right by, we still are, an opportunity for kids to tell their stories. And it's almost like, you know, so what happened to you over that time? And autumn and fall is a perfect time actually for grief and for processing grief and new beginnings. And I think what we as educators need to insist on, that it's not a burnt out thing. The systemic indicators are not in place. This infrastructure of support for our educators, for our students, for our caretakers are not in place. And they weren't prior to COVID. So I think as educators and as mental health advocates and justice workers, we need to ensure that this comes into the conversation, that our mental health and social emotional needs of our children and our school, our learning communities was in a pervasive state prior to COVID. Mm-hmm. So, and then all the injustices that were so blatantly evident in everyone's lives. These are tremendous learning opportunities for our kids that we, again, just get back to the intellect, get back to the curriculum. And I think we need national policies and standards in place for every child having access to mental health services, regardless of where you live, regardless of your zip code or any other, or what other great teacher or administration you have that will let it into your building. And as a country, we took dental health back how many years ago, 50 years ago, was a critical element and a critical right to mental health services. It is for every child and for every citizen. And we have to reframe how our systems operate. And we as leaders in education, realms and service providers have to be the ones to reframe and restructure this. We do not and should not ever have, and especially now, wait until kids bomb out in third grade or at the end of second till we start the process of evaluating them. You know, every child, let's incorporate ACEs, the whole, you know, all of, and PACEs with the positive experiences as well. We need to do a national assessment or other statewide. And that's what's so great about this virtual platform is you're talking to people in Kentucky. You know, I'm talking to people all around the world, and educators and caretakers have the same concerns about this is not sustainable as the ones providing the care and the justice work. So we have to be honest and call it out like it is when we're in these groups. And we've got to switch up how we are even meeting and how we're talking about what to do. We're assuming we know what kids need, or we're assuming we know what parents or teachers need. But every space that I'm going in, of all those stakeholders, is crying out for help. So educators plan ahead, educators observe and respond. And I think we need to be more proactively insistent that our state take care of our kids before we get to a point where it is a crisis, but it already is a crisis. So I really feel it's important that we have the honesty and the transparency to talk about how we operate and reimagine that, but also what our next step is to ensure that when we go out into our spaces, that we're not taking the messaging as the okay answer, but that we insist that we have the hard next steps in place so that we are truly making a difference in kids' lives every day and parents.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you, Susan. I see Brian, and then Adriana, and then Emily. I love it. Bring the dialogue.
Well, and thanks for that, Susan. And one of the things as you're speaking, I was considering was an old YouTube video, and a South African educator who was really talking about his aha moment, because he really thought he was helping young men by being hard on them. It was truly in his heart, but that was his way. And it wasn't until a student that he expelled, who ended up ultimately going into therapy for, drugs and addiction, that student came back and said, why did I have to get expelled to crumble to the ground in order to uncover the healing I needed? And some of these systems, the punitive systems, obviously you can't punish pain out of someone. In this reflection of this YouTuber, and I'll share it out, was that he really thought he was doing his best, and he could get funding streams for mathematicians and engineers, but not making a great, parent or someone who's contributing and connected. So, I also step one back layer out into our collective values in what's being asked of our system. So that was just something that kind of came to me as you were speaking, is the reframing of our values such that we can all be aligned in our mission and make the agreements. Because he really felt, and his intention was to help this kid, but that was how he was told he was supposed to help, by being hard, tough, etc. So just some wonderings there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, I think that resonated for a lot of people. You can't punish the pain out of someone. So many of us were like, yes, like that. I felt that one. Been there, experienced it, probably done it in service in the same way, right? That I was trying to help. I was trying to do my best by being hard on someone. Absolutely. Emily. Or Adriana, what was the order, Yasmina? Do you remember?
Adriana,
then Emily. Okay, got it. Thank you for keeping track.
Could you just show up that wheel from Beam? Because that wheel from Beam is exactly what I need. I am currently facing a problem with our child protection services in New Zealand. And the problem is that all the information of their best practice, it's all written down on their web pages of practice, but it's all wordy. And this makes it accessible, and it shows really good practice of how people should relate and work with, and not just child protection services like social workers, but with teachers as well. How do we work with family? And this is so accessible, and it's so helpful for us to look at that. And like Brian was saying, it's about intervening early. And why should we have to wait until the parents are struggling and then they say, let's remove the child, because as soon as they remove the child, they create pain and trauma for the child and the parent. And they should have intervened earlier, and that's the same with our children and students in schools. Intervene early before they get to the state where they're getting excluded. Oh, I just love this. I just want to say that this is awesome, and I'm going to use it. Yeah.
The thing I dropped in the chat box, and then I'll go to Emily. Actually, Adriana, you shared with me, and I almost put it in this. If I'd known you were going to be here, I almost put it in this presentation. But this was something that you shared during our Building Bridges of Hope cohort about when we were talking about restorative justice. And this talks about the different elements of being human. Am I right? Here, let me share the screen in case you aren't able to access what I just put in the chat box.
Oh yeah, Te Whare Tapawha. Yes, and that's the model that we use in New Zealand, because it tells about you need all those elements to keep that. This is a Māori whare, a meeting house where Māori come together, and it's the centre where we all come together. And it just says about the importance of the interrelationship of all of those things, and they all need to be valued, the whole, the person as a whole, and that the land, and also the land is really important for Māori, because that's where, we get grounded. So if you can understand the importance of grounding and the importance of having all those parts, the spiritual, mental and emotional, family and social, the community, and also the physical. Amazing. Thank you for that. I'm glad that was important to you. Yeah, go back to your Indigenous peoples as well, because what came from the old times is really valuable, especially now in these days. Thank you.
Thanks, Adriana.
Thank you for giving that to me, Emily.
I was going to follow up with some of the thoughts that I think her name is Leora. Sorry if I said that wrong. Was talking about, and I think the biggest thing from what I'm hearing from everyone is that we want to put a certain category or put people in categories. And one of the things that I have experienced is the fact that it's really about pushing past our own perspectives, right? Because ultimately, if we come from a more deficit mindset of what kids or are unable to do based on what they look like, we're missing, I think, the big picture. A part of being culturally responsive and a part of this work is making sure that, number one, we establish, like you said, that relationship and getting to know who those kids are, right? And just a little small story about just how I grew up and with education. My mom was an educator. And so my mom taught for 30 years, retired. And with her being an educator, I had other opportunities. So I grew up going to schools where a lot of the population of the students didn't look like me. So it forced me to learn a lens of more about being the humanity part of it, right? And that we are all humans, and that even though these people may not look like me, they had some experiences that I personally didn't have. They had some challenges that I potentially didn't have. And so I was forced to take a more like just by person, looking at people's character and learning about them as individuals. And I think a part of this work is the first step before we even move into, some of these social justice and advocating for some of these things, is taking a look at oneself. And I think that's was a part of my mental health definition, is that once you're connected to yourself and understanding who you are and what your traumas are, what your positive childhood experiences are and negative, and being able to take a look at that and what those experiences are, I think that is the bigger picture, because it's then when you're able to move into other spaces and have that lens of, it's not about who they are, but maybe what they've been through that you can then work through and work from. But if we come from the mindset that there's a group of people, no matter where they're from, or, you know, this stigma of where they're from, that there's a deficit automatically, then we're not helping. We're actually doing more hurting than helping. I think it's very important that we just look at the communities in which we teach and knowing those stories, and not just automatically assuming certain positions to move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I keep hearing those words. Thank you for sharing that, like stories, knowing, connecting, like understanding other people's stories, storytelling, like the power of being able to share our stories, creating your, you know, being the author of your own story. I think that is really important to keep in mind. Thank you for sharing that. One of the questions, and this kind of led me to thinking that as Yasmina and I were like dreaming up questions, one of them, actually they kind of go together, but in your presentation, Yasmina, you said that mental health is linked to physical health, clearly through that wonderful echo diagram. Is it linked to academic health?
Why, yes, Laura. Well, yes, Laura. Sorry, I can't even talk this morning. Mental health is linked to academic achievement. So I did totally set her up with this question because I was like, please ask me this. So if any of you have the role of influencing school leaders to make decisions with their budgets or with their schedules, my favorite foot in the door method to get into the room to have the conversation is, did you know mental health is linked to academic achievement and graduation rates? And suddenly you and the decision makers have an aligned purpose. And sometimes that's the hardest part. When you need academic instruction time so that you can teach some of these tools, or when you need the ability to respond and mobilize quickly as a mental health professional, creating those trusted relationships with your administrators is key. And starting and opening with, not only is mental health linked to the physical health, which means kids are in their classes more often because they're more physically well. It means their parents are more engaged because they're more mentally well. It also means that they're going to perform better on standardized tests, on graduation. It means they're going to excel better in sports. And so when you're working with folks who might not come from a mental health background, or when you're working with folks who might not have, I know in my state, some of our teacher preparation programs include maybe half a semester on child development. So when we come in as mental health professionals and expect our administrators and decision makers to have the robust understanding of how mental health is connected to some of the things that they value and that they are measured on for their performance, it can be an uphill battle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's some, right now, one of the reasons that I really wanted you to be my very special guest this month was thinking about all of the funding that's coming. There's just all of a sudden this like deluge of funding for mental health supports for schools. And I also see conversations from school leaders like, whoa, okay, how do we spend all this in the right way? Or just, I think my fear is that it just comes and they're like scatters, right? So how do we direct this purposefully? How do we use it for sustainability? How do we use it for support? Because there is, especially in California, just so much, and it's kind of one time. Like this is the first time I've ever seen this kind of funding coming at schools and elevating the conversation. And so wanting to see this supported in a way that that really makes a difference around that. And how do we get the conversation? And I think, you and I also talked about that, the pandemic certainly opened up an empathy window that didn't maybe exist before with educators, school leaders. Folks are wanting to dive into this a little bit more, which is a wonderful place for us to be in the conversation. Brian.
Yeah, just And I would say too, with this funding, I'm seeing some very interesting functional realities come up. Both here in California, we have a second round of network of closed loop referral systems funding coming down through ACEs Aware, as well as ARPA, so the American Rescue Act. But the people are hurting now, and the funding's supposed to serve people, yet the processes in which we're asked to do the RFP, funding for services and actually getting people in place to be the network of care, right? Because I always think the dollars translate to people who can provide the services. There's this systemic delay, and it's one time. So then it also limits a bit of the functional trust and sustainability dimension, because we're so dependent on the ebb and flow of funding. And I forget if I've said this, forgive me, to this group, but I would much rather, 10 years of $5,000 a year funding than one-time front end, because of the inconsistency in itself sort of disrupts the care process and the connections needed to do the work. And so I just, with the and of the money coming down, it's also as if there's not enough vehicles or mechanisms to allocate it in a sustainable and connected way when we don't have the people at the table who are actually using it. There's sort of this doling out from Mount High versus some of the power sharing that I heard within, I believe, Emily's comments, is there's a power sharing dynamic, that is still pretty prevalent. So I just wonder out loud on that as well. But give me sustainable and consistent.
So I'm going to unpack, I'm going to take off my mental health leader hat, and I'm going to unpack and pantomime my state leader hat, because I think this is a different conversation. So I'm going to firmly put that one on. And 2, harken back to the disclaimer slide that the opinion I'm about to give you is 100% my own. And 3, so take it for what you will. So based on, in my former role as the director of school safety and social wellness, when I started, there was no pandemic. But I did have the emergency response unit in my department with 1 half-time person until the pandemic started. And a lot of our responsibilities was funneling and receiving the just cluster of emergency funds from the various different sources, DEMA, FEMA, the State Department of Health, the County Department of Health, the state education budget. So for your state leaders out there, it's really confusing. It's not sustainable, and it's the government doing the best it can with infrastructure that has been systematically reduced in its human capacity in the last 20 years. So in America. So like my one unit was all of a sudden became responsible like overnight from $30 million to almost 60 million. And I didn't get to hire any more people. And a lot of that money was one-time use. So what I would recommend if I were folks at the local level is I would take a really good look at your technological infrastructure. And the reason I dumped that link in the chat to the Padlet is in my state, and this is the way I like to frame it to pique people's interest, my state accidentally legislated Project Aware. And if any of you are familiar with Project Aware, it is the federal program that is supposed to unite the systems of care. So it makes the healthcare system talk with the education system. And it started in response to the Sandy Hook shootings, because the person who perpetrated those shootings had been identified in various child serving systems, but none of those systems spoke to each other. And so there was no way to prevent it. So Arizona accidentally legislated Project Aware. And the great part of that is because it was accidentally done, they didn't realize how hard it was going to be. But the short story long of that is, in order to implement a component of this legislation, the Department of Education had to figure out a way to communicate huge components of information to the health department without violating any privacy regulations on either side. And so we're going on year 3 of trying to implement this legislation. And we meet like once every 3 weeks to talk about all the different barriers and stuff. But what I can say that I observed that I think is the biggest hurdle and could probably do with one-time use money is, my opening line is, sometimes the government's running on Windows 97. Like for real, we're running on Windows 97. And it's because our budgets have been so whittled down to the absolute necessity that at the state level, often those requests to update technological infrastructure are just fall on deaf ears because we barely have enough to operate, at least in my state. So I don't know what it looks like in your state, but when we have all these one-time funds, that's something that I think, okay, we can do a major overhaul of how our systems communicate. We can do a major overhaul of how we're tracking need, right? If you think about, a lot of you are on like campuses, and if you're working with any type of mental health screening referral system, your student information systems are powerful data tools. But oftentimes, how many of you got to sit down with someone who coded or created that student information system to learn how to write a query so that you can pull specific academic attendance and discipline data on students and graph it out?
Yeah.
Your student information system can likely do that pretty easily. But we don't often have time with those folks to teach us the technicalities. So if I like, what can I do with all this money? Update your infrastructure, update it, because the next time we'll get to update it is the next time we have a pandemic.
Right. Yeah. And we, that also thinking about the big, right? Those are the big problems at the 30,000 foot might feel overwhelming to those on the ground. Well, like, well, I can't do anything about how the state's going to use that money. How can I, thinking about this reframing of mental health and wellness and relationships and stories and connection and self-reflection and, all the things that we've talked about, taking care of educator mental health. How does this play out at the school site level? How do we, thinking about what we can do tomorrow, as educators, as folks, knowing, thinking about this reframing, how might we proceed going forward? What do you think? And this is a question to all of you too.
Okay.
Yeah, Yasmin and I that was one of the questions we dreamed up, and it was just a perfect segue. Like, if you're feeling overwhelmed by all this, in this reframing, how do we focus on our internal locus of control?
Yes, this is the conversation that all my mentors have with me every time we talk. Yasmina, what's in your locus of control? You can't get upset at the whole world. That's not productive. What's in your locus of control? So if you are at a school site, if you're an administrator or a school, how many of you are administrators in this room? Do we have hand raise function?
We do.
Administrators, school mental health professionals, teachers. Okay, we got, oh, hi, Tiffany. I think I recognize you. Okay, so here's what I would say that we could do. Start with your teachers. Pour your resources into caring for the mental health of your teachers. And I wanted to have this question because every time we interact with a child is a teachable moment. Our kids absorb everything we do. How many of you have had a toddler that picked up your curse words and said that at an inappropriate time, maybe at church? I don't know, right? So our kids are watching. It doesn't matter if they're early childhood. It doesn't matter if they're high school. If you're in a classroom and you can authentically look and say, I am mentally well and able to be here, and my school administration is taking care of me and modeling what they want our kids to do to take care of themselves, then we're ready to move on to the kids. I don't think we're ready to move on to the kids yet. The kids need us. The kids need us. Don't get that wrong. But you can't fill from an empty bucket. And we're in a workforce crisis. And one of the things I want to leave you to ponder is perhaps the workforce crisis is because we've been asking people to pour from an empty bucket for 20 years, maybe longer. And then a pandemic happened. And like, that was it. Well teachers equal well students. Yeah, Tanisha, teachers need TLC more than ever. And so change the narrative. That there's a school in LA, and I forgot, I learned about it like 4 years ago. They invested a bunch of money into teacher mental health programs. They created like really they had a private investor to create a beautiful teachers lounge, and they provided the mental health support first to the teachers and then rolled it down to the kids.
Yeah.
Now, if you go back to that funding guide that I put in the presentation as a resource, there are ways to flexibly and creatively fund programs in that way. I'll just throw out there Title IV. Title IV dollars are incredibly flexible if you're an educator. Title IV dollars can be used to support healthy and safe schools. That's really, really vague on purpose. But a lot of schools in my state were not taking advantage of their Title IV dollars because it's a fairly new federal program in America. Sorry, Adriana, you're gonna have to space out during this part. It's a fairly new federal program in America, and it is specifically to help create culturally appropriate and specific services. And it comes with a minimum. It comes with a minimum of $10,000. So if you qualify for Title IV, you get a minimum of $10,000. That's huge, huge for a rural district. So I'll give you an example of how a district in my state use their Title IV dollars. They are in northern Arizona and on indigenous land, and they use their Title IV dollars to plant a garden with some elders in their community to learn about seed saving of these certain type of gourds. They planted a garden with their gourds, and then all semester long, they grew it. It was a community activity. They harvested the gourds, and then with the elders of the community, they make those gourds into musical instruments. And that is a social emotional learning activity. You grew something, you made something, you learn how to work together, and you create a community.
They connected.
And you involved an elder.
Yep.
So it doesn't have to be a program that you buy out of a box. And in fact, I would say it shouldn't be, because if you can buy it out of a box, you're going to have to sell people on it, right? You're going to have to get your school community to want to use it. Co-construct your interventions with your community that you serve. Ask your teachers, how can we support you? And when they say, I need to have my prep period, we have to figure out how to do that. It's hard, but there's a workforce shortage. I don't have the answers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many examples, especially from the work that I did here in Los Angeles with community schools, but that thinking around creative solutions that promote the things that we were talking about, equal mental health, mental wellness, right? Like community, connection to yourself, learning about yourself, relating to others, having empathy, building relationships, building trust, being vulnerable, all of these things that are contributing to a healthy environment for staff and for students. A lot of those are community-driven creative responses like yours. And I think you and I were story sharing about these kind of things. And I worked with a high school here in South LA that had, we had them really drill down into their data disaggregated by like hallways and times and students, like who was getting suspended. And they figured out that there was a group of 9th grade African-American girls during 5th period, in a specific area of the school that were causing 90% of the suspensions that they were facing. And once they realized what the issue was, before it was just felt chaotic and they were being reactive, right? Once they figured out what it was, then they could think about it. They brought the community in and the parents, and what they came up with was looking to a mental health partner in the community that created a girls empowerment group. And so this was the response, was those girls were then working with a mental health provider from the community who was also a Black woman who talked, and then the moms came in too, and they did this whole community-driven response to what they perceived as a behavior and discipline issue, and it evaporated. the discipline issues, the mental health, the perceived mental health crisis was responded to in a very supportive, community-driven way. And they had a completely different response to what they thought perceived as a problem. And so there's a lot of ways to rethink how we can build supportive mental health systems on a school site, how we can respond to what we think of as illness or crisis, I guess. So yeah, I love that example that you have. All right, so we are, thank you, Brian. It's 10:18. We still have 12 minutes. And those are, I think, all of the really pressing questions, burning questions that we wanted to make sure we got to, and you guys have asked a lot of really good questions. So I would like to make sure with our last few minutes before we do a closing, what other things have come up for you in this hour and a half with us? Is there anything else? And you can put it in the chat, you can unmute yourself. Is there something, raise your hand. Is there something else that you would love for us to kind of bounce around as a group, or that's present at your work site? Thank you, Adriana, always reminding us to save the chat. Yes.
Save the chat. And while you're there, now you have the whole message from Diana. I was just trying to copy the survey.
Thanks, Diana.
Thank you, Diana, for being the project coordinator extraordinaire. If you like going to things for free and you think more things should be free, you help me stay free by completing that survey and telling our funder that I was working today, to put it lack of a better way. But I'm just kidding. I read every single piece of feedback. So if you have something warm or cool feedback, I take it all super seriously, because meeting the needs of the field is what I'm here to do. I've been out of the classroom just long enough that I fear becoming irrelevant.
And I put in the PACES and education, the PACES connection page, which is where I am coming from. And I also have one specific on education issues in positive and adverse childhood experiences, a PACES connection in education. If you're not a member, please join. That's where we advertise all of these.
Laura, yes. How do you become a member? I'm not a member. I actually don't know how to become one.
If you go to the PACES connection page and you just up in the right-hand corner, it just says join and it's free. We moderate it. So you just fill out your information, and then in like a 24 hours or sometimes in the same day, you'll get approved, but it's more just to keep the bots out. But as long as we deem that you are a real live human being, it's free. And then you can then we have pages based on interest. So we have PACES in higher education, PACES in juvenile justice. I moderate the PACES in education page and work around that. And we will be doing one of these kind of discussions every month. Last month, we had one on critical race theory in education, as in It's Not Happening. And you can watch that on our YouTube channel from last month. And working on our topic for next month. But this month, we were so excited to devote it to school mental health. And thinking about it.
While we have the experts in the room, who has a suggestion for next month's topic?
Yeah, or even because I want to do one every month, maybe not December. And so I would love to hear, that's a great idea, Yasmin. I would love to hear from the audience what burning topics, because I know a lot of folks that would make great guests.
Was something about education, trauma-informed education you wish people were talking about, but no one is? There you go. You got to make it like a headline.
School connectedness. Decolonializing SEL. Tiffany, I love it.
Ooh,
school connectedness and belonging. Oh, those are great. Thank you, guys.
There you go. Look, you got one less thing off your to-do.
I know. These are amazing.
Working smarter, not harder, 2021.
Go ahead.
Does anyone mind if I plug an upcoming event for my agency that this group might be interested in?
Not at all.
So this Thursday, and maybe if Diana is still here, she can drop the link to the constant contact. This Thursday, the National Training and Technical Assistance Center is kicking off its Trauma Responsive Action Informed Learning Series, TRAILS, for our next fiscal year, the federal fiscal year. So we're like, Happy New Year, but it's October. We are going to be talking about trauma-informed practices and unpacking the complexities of trauma and resilience. So on Thursday at 10 a.m., there we go, Diana's got it. At 10 a.m. Pacific time, our event kicks off, and I am moderating a super dynamic panel of experts talking about trauma and resilience, including 2 young people with lived experience. Our keynote is a young person with lived experience in the juvenile justice system, and we'll be having small group breakouts where we can discuss some of the complexities of trauma-informed work, and you can inform the products and services we offer for the next year. Ooh, neuroscience training, Susan.
Ooh,
we might need a date. We might need a date.
And I'm going to be at the Trails event. I'm excited about that. Thank you. Caring for caretakers, neuroscience training. Yes, all these are great. Thank you. Because then I can start brainstorming.
You've got the next year.
I know. This is great. Caretakers. Yes. Neuroscience. Yeah, and if you guys have good ideas for speakers as well, anything, just let me put my email if I can talk and type at the same time. Hold on. I will put my email in the chat.
I'm also excited to report there's a fellow Nebraskan in the room today, Mariella. Go Big Red.
And, you know, I didn't want to take away time from before, but when you were talking about big state systems, I will let you know it wasn't just Arizona. I used to be on the Title I team for Wisconsin at their Department of Ed, and we were charged with working with Department of Children and Families for the same kind of reason, you know, that we had to, I was in charge of homeless and foster youth, and so they had foster youth in their department and homeless youth as well, but no one was talking to each other, and it was causing kind of great harm to the youth involved. And so, but this was as we drilled down into what the actual problem was, it was technology. Mm-hmm. It was data sharing, 100%. After months of meetings, that's what it came down to, was an inability to share data across ancient state platforms that didn't speak the same language. So I just wanted to affirm what you were saying. Anyone listening that has control over big dollars, you're right, absolutely.
And 100%. And sometimes I giggle when I talk to people who believe that the governments have the capability to indulge in large conspiracy theories. I'm like, yo, they're struggling with Excel on their current platform. They can't do that. They can't do that. We're working on reply all.
Right. All right, everyone. Well, in closing, as we say goodbye, if you want to put a word in the chat that may reflect your feelings about today, how did this feel for you? One word that you are leaving with, and we will bid you adieu until next month. But we're so glad this was useful, inspired, hopeful, awesome. You're welcome. Thank you for giving us the gift of time, invigorated.
If anyone wants to say bees, that's acceptable.
I will forever treasure the Nicolas Cage spectrum of wellness. I thank you for creating that in my life, Yasmina.
You're welcome.
Yeah,
it was worth the hour I spent copy paste.
Yes, the greatest gift that you all can give us is your time, and so we are really, really honored that you chose to spend it with us, and we hope it was worth your while. And it was nice to see all of you.
I'll hang out here with Lara until 10:30 Pacific time for an after party. If anyone has questions, comments, interpretive dance, more Nicolas Cage memes.
We're really talented. Yeah, so feel free to log off. And if you want to stay with us for a few more minutes, we'll be here. We appreciate all of you. And thank you so much. And I'm going to stop the recording.
I think that's fair.